Decolonizing Research through podcast as storytelling. I'm Jessica Hum, and this is the first interview that I conducted as part of the project with a former colleague and mentor, teacher of mine from my time working in the Clicho region in the Northwest Territories. I first connected with Dr. John Bezo as he had been and continues to work with the Clicho government as a special advisor. And my role in the Clicho government was a land use planner, and John really took it upon himself to meet with and connect with any new staff at the Clicho Government Lands Department. And I further developed a relationship with both John Bezo and his wife, Bertha Rabascazo, over the years that I worked with the Clicho, working and enjoying time out on the land. I had an opportunity in 2018 to get in a canoe and paddle alongside John Bezo and his wife, Bertha, and several dozens of other Clicho youth and older folks as we paddled in boats along the traditional trails of the Clicho ancestors. And so I'm reminded of John's advice to those connecting with the land and the water and the trails. He had once written actually he spoke these words in a joint presentation with another elder, Joseph Judas, in speaking about reconnecting to the land. And John said, the further you step away from the land, the further you get away from the original teacher of the language, that is the land. It first spoke to us to say, here's where the fish are, here's where the moose lives, here's where the caribou cross, and this is where the good berries are. And all that kind of information was provided to us. It communicated with us. And in that communication, we need to bring people back onto the landscape so that we can reconnect with that environment of teaching. As a brief intro to John Bezo, I absolutely cannot cover all of his accomplishments, but we have agreed that this short intro best describes his recent work. He was the Chief Land Claims Negotiator for the former Treaty 11 Council of the Northwest Territories from 1994 until the establishment of the Clicho government in 2005, when the former Treaty 11 Council concluded. John is now a senior advisor to the Clicho government. He has an Honourary Doctor of Laws from University of Alberta in recognition of his work in the development of the new Clicho government, as well as his contributions to projects that are built upon a foundation of Clicho language, culture, and way of life. So before we started the interview recording, the first words John B. began with when I got on the phone was, let's just let go of a timeline and just go with the flow. And I really want to talk about decolonizing research. And so I had prepared 4 questions where decolonizing research was really saved for the end. But as this is really a culmination of John's lifetime work, he is always working on decolonizing research. And he most often talks about this in person when you're watching John give a talk. He's often doing things with his hands, like drawing on a whiteboard. So his cosmology in the Clicho region in many of his teachings is quite famous now. However, we were doing this orally. We were doing this teaching, storytelling, and story listening through telephone conversation. So many of the metaphors that he describes, you're going to have to just visualize. In the end, we ended up covering all 4 of the themes that I wanted to discuss. And some of the key messages I will paraphrase when we get to the end. But first here, let's start with John Bezo and his introduction to decolonizing research.
You know, the decolonization number one is becoming aware of where you are. You know, like I give a lot of talks all over the place, and one of the things that is very it's not very clear in many sectors of society, is understanding what's really on the ground, because we were so invisible for so many years that the research that was done in the early years, in the 50s, and even as early as, when the first explorers came in, they did their observation. The observation that they gave out was that they were there for a purpose, and part of that purpose is to get that job done using all available resources, natural or unnatural. And the only natural thing that, but the thing was that they depended on the natural, meaning that to do research, there has to be some accommodation. That accommodation means that if they're coming from an institution of the Crown, that you almost have to lay out the red carpet. That means that you have to feed them, you have to transport them. But they'll just do the observations without getting into the detail. I've looked at a lot of books, and it's all about what they observed and the shortcomings of these people to some degree, not taking into consideration that the only reason that they're doing the exploration, or now they call it research, is that they needed the local people to get them that information by putting them at certain places where they can do these observations. And so it's all about trying to survive in that environment. Because if we're looking at the history of the relationship on the Western research, is that when they first came into North America, it's about researching what the land has to offer, this new land that they discovered. The research into what does it hold. Well, it holds a lot of natural resources, which is the animals, the fur, and the navigation, but it was all dependent on the people on the ground. And it might have been a little bit more brutal the further south you go because it's warmer. But the further north you go, the colder it gets and the more that you have to depend on the locals to survive. And so that was the big difference, is that in the south it's much more people and much more people spread out on the landscape. And it was probably easier for them to plow through those people. But here in the north, the population doesn't grow. It's cold, and costs of living are high. So the impact wasn't about like the physical thing. Yes, there were physical casualties along the way, but it's more mental up here. It's more mental, meaning that you were legislated into a box called through Indian Affairs, and you were kept there since 1876, and people are still in there, and so we're not part of mainstream society's economics, mainstream society's education, mainstream society services. And so what you get is that if you want to be part of mainstream society, you have to act like a mainstream society, which means that in the north here, because everything's dependent on the community. That prior to 1961, before you had the chance to vote, that nobody really bothered you. You just can go out and do your thing to survive on the land with your stories and places to visit, and you keep it alive. And when you get into the community setting, where the community setting is already locked up by government as their own, so they provide all the services for the community, for the public. And in the early years, the public were the government workers, health workers, teachers, RCMP, where they ended up with all the electricity. They had the running water. They had vehicles. They had their all the necessities. But I don't think the public included the indigenous, because I remember that same time there where people were moving into the communities because the law was that if you're a Canadian citizen and you have school children in your midst, those kids should be in school. And so they moved into the community with no housing. They stayed in tents for years. And, a lot of things have happened. So up to that point, most of the research was in observation, where some leaders might be quoted, but generally it's an observation of where people were, what they were doing, but not necessarily their thoughts about the future. And the only time that their thoughts of the future happened was through the pipeline hearings back in the 70s, because it's a process, a hearing that was commissioned by government, to go and listen to the people from the hinterland about their thoughts on the pipeline. I think that's when a lot of information came out that talked about not necessarily what the hearing was about, was whether there should be a pipeline going down in the Kansas Valley. And so people took that opportunity that, there's a hearing where we can talk, so they had a chance to not necessarily talk about the approval of the pipeline, but what's it going to do for us? Like, what's it going to do for our language, our culture, our way of life? Will there be employment? Will there be better education? How is it going to impact our lives? And so the infrastructure back then, there wasn't much. All people had was their voices. And so there was a 10-year moratorium put on there, at least so people can start thinking about what's going on. And the pipeline never really happened. And some say it has on a smaller scale. But regardless, it was a chance to raise your voice. So the research that was done in the early years didn't talk about people with assets, but people that were on the landscape, that just lived the way that they used to live. But the system that was brought in as early as 1763 was, before 1763, there was the big fur trade that drew down all your wildlife, all your natural resources. So you had no control over it because when you're using it to live. And the second biggest drawdown was the ownership of land. That was, the British Crown took it upon themselves that they are now the ones in power, so it's going to belong to them. And the biggest other drawdown was the non-renewable resources through the treaties. So we really cut it out. We were gutted out. The earliest that we were gutted out was in the 1920s. So we never had resources until just recently, about 20 years ago. And we started, big diamond mines were happening, and that's when, a little bit of things started to happen, but it's still, it's not a nation-to-nation relationship. It's more like a big corporation trying to appease in the smallest way possible to get access to those rights that they have acquired through their own systems, but not necessarily ours that we haven't developed yet. So, so a lot of this research in the old days is collected as an entity of government, like universities, government agencies, corporate bodies, that any research that's done by institutions licensed by governments makes its way up towards a policy ladder. And policies are formed by these entities and agencies and corporations up to the decision makers, and then they legislate it into how the country should continue developing. But a lot of this research was without, consent. There might have been, but research wasn't understood well at the time. That, like if you haven't had anybody telling you anything, except for when you need their labor or your knowledge, that if you had researchers coming in that are really interested in your life, and you start talking about it. But what was not understood at the time was that research is a basis for policy development. And if it's an observational research, then the impact on your real life is real. And it also informs government that there's a need for educational facilities, housing, jobs, all these things, the trappings of the Western world. That research is for the Western world, and the solution comes from that Western world, that we should turn these Indians into white people or Canadians, that they should be part of this system. But one of the problems with that was that in 1876, we were put into this box of the Indian Act, and all the resources that might be coming off your land goes to these, entities and agencies with the incentives of big governments on both sides, like federal and provincial and territorial. And so they spread the wealth to their entities, but nothing goes back to the original people. And so that's the way the system is set up right now. And so when we're talking about decolonization, decolonizing research is that we have self-government now, but even if we didn't have self-government or better understanding, is that for any research to take place, we have to not only consent, but we need to ensure that the information that we provide is about making an impact into policy development. Okay, because we still need to be part of the necessary evil. I'm not saying it like it comes from the pits of hell. I'm just saying that. I'm just saying that systemically, there's no room for us. And part of getting that voice, you can go through the claim, you can set up all these kind of things, but in the end, it's really about what would be found is that the Western Front is very solid. It's really tight. It's something that has been honed for the last 500 years. It's super tight. It's what holds the country together. It's what makes Canada, okay, with all its forces, with all its jurisdictions, with all its acknowledgement from the rest of the world that they are an independent nation. As of 1982, anyways, that's you're on your own. So that's what built Canada, but Canada built it by not acknowledging the original people that were there and keeping them at a spot where we would not advance. And because a lot of this stuff that's going on is based on assumptions, it's based on a way of thinking way back then, that in today's terms, it's a little bit different. That, it takes a while for us to come around with new information and, younger people getting education and, we study a lot more in our own way. That we've always known that we had a language, culture, way of life. We've always known how we lived here, like in the north or any other place that's isolated. That we had a way of life which is unlike Western living, and for some reason, because the Western thing is 500 years old, the whole system is driven that way. And so if you're part of it and you're in a box as part of the tail of this comet, that you would never ever make yourself presence in the front, where the decision making is coming from, because it's going in a totally wrong direction for us anyways, because it's stripping us of everything that we have. And the longer it goes on, the most likely that eventually you'll have total assimilation. But the thing is that there has been challenges in the past, legal challenges. And in some of these legal challenges that people have convinced, the law dispensers at least, that there's something wrong here, that we have pre-existing rights, okay, that were never addressed. And an assumption was made that people threw up their hands and now they're in ownership and now they're the bus drivers and we're just the passengers. And the longer we're passengers, the further we get away from home because we're not sure which direction we're going. And we start speaking in different languages, have our own different thoughts. And we're further away from the communities that was there before. So we have this decolonization is about the only way you can really do decolonization in a meaningful way is to change the way that the system operates, right? And one of them is to bring those reasonable voices to an area where we can plug into an institution of government or licensed by government like universities in partnership with, even companies that see a need of making sure that the things that they extract, the profits of those things are kind of like they were spreading it all over Canada to the other entities through employment and benefits and all those kind of things, that they get to know that the original people that were here don't benefit from what you're doing. And to me, that's decolonization, is that the colonizers have had a system that they haven't changed in the last 500 years. And so the only thing that we have right now is our voices, and if our voices fail, then, you might protest to just keep it alive and say, look, there's still something wrong. And the best form of research that's coming out right now is where we would do research in partnership with universities. Provided there's a subject, there's a program that our government will agree on a research with a university, including, the agencies of government, where if it has to do with health, if it has to do with mining, or if it has to do with social services, child welfare, any kind of social research or economic research or language, all these kind of research that's going on, so that if we do research with institutions from the Western side, that through agreement we can, bring forth what we have with consent, that you're getting it from the source and you're not getting it from observation, so that the impact is a lot more. But those are things that doesn't happen readily across Canada. It happens in pockets. So the only real thing that we have right now is the reason things are the way they are in Western society is that the narrative hasn't changed for the last 500 years. And so the more we talk about our own narratives about our own history to our own young people. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long, long time because, especially the last 150 years, we've been led to believe that what we had was wrong. Even our spirituality was wrong. Even our naming of our children were wrong, and even the way that we fed or made a living is wrong. But that's all we had, because we're not part of the Western front. So that narrative through decolonization is that we need to tell our own stories to our own people. And most of our own people are in a headspace of listening to electronic messages. And some of them are, with the elders who haven't transitioned into the English language or the English way of thinking, that they are the real storytellers. But a lot of their audio recording has probably been collected over the years. And so a lot of these things have to be dug into to revitalize or revisit what was there before, so that they can be, extracted for research if it's something that we would need to advance, strengthening our language, culture, way of life, because that's what it's about, anyways. Is to strengthen what we have, and part of that strengthening is that, one, you need a land base, and that land base question has to be worked out through agreement, and what kind of say you have on that land base and the citizenship, and methods of how we would still, be part of the Western society, because it's the only way to share the benefits. Okay. And if you look at the whole of Canada, what happens is that the resources are authorized by Canada for its entities, and the entities hire Canadians, and most of the time those hirings for Canadians doesn't include the Indigenous, because the narrative is that they're already taken care of. There are people that don't pay taxes, there are people that don't work, there are people that don't take care of their children, all of these kind of things. But that's where the research has to happen. Well, who broke those things down? And how do we rebuild? And most of the because we're dealing with the Western Front, they'll say, well, you might have to take treatment and go as far south as you can. And if you need to learn more about the languages, you should go to the university and study language. All these kind of things. But we're not. But in the end, people still have to come back around, and to do the research into why it's not part of the mainstream. And so it all boils back down to who authorized them, and who, in partnership, was it done, and how old is it? So we're constantly grappling with, the engagement processes now, because we're interested in outcomes. but those outcomes have to be kind of evaluated on the merits, and the merits are Western. The only merits are the Western methods, whether it was successful or not, and most likely, it's rubber stamped as the success story. But the research nowadays, today, is that the information that we bring to the table, there's no method of evaluating that because it's not part of the Western way of thinking. So the information that we provide, like I'm doing right now, how do you evaluate it? When there's no methods, how do you create an evaluation to give it credibility? Because we've known that in the last 500 years, nothing was ever credited to the sources that it might have been gleaned from. And so you end up being in that same school of thought. So the part of the research is to have an impact into injecting it with the North America continent thoughts, because our whole system is based on a way of life from Britain, Great Britain. And so everybody's been transplanted here with all those rules and regulations. And because there's no First Nations in Great Britain, that you're looked over, you don't fit into the equation. Okay. And since it's given Canada, to make decisions on their own in 1982, that's when we started finding real voices that are kind of recognized through court challenges. But we can't keep fighting court challenges all the time. We can't become Canadian through going to court all the time. You just become, what's yours is yours and what's ours is ours, with no dialogue in between. I think research is what drives a way of thinking, and that research models are based on that crude and cruel form that was developed alongside with a base thinking from overseas. That if we're going to develop research in the north in Canada, we have to take into consideration what was there before Canada, so we can keep it truly Canadian and not a knockoff society. So that's where the challenge is that when we do research, we do it with our own entities, with the entities of Canada and its full force, so that the messaging is right and it's accredited by Western institutions' involvement, so that they can work it up the system to say, hey, look, there's a thought process that we've never really looked into before. It's about it's over 500 years old. It's before we came here, especially in Canada. In the last 150 years, there was a school of thought before us, and that school of thought had its own economics, it had its own governance, it had its own way of life, and people thrived. There was no debt, and people took care of themselves. And so we've managed in the last 150 years to bring those people to the knees. And now we see them as deficits. We see them on the streets. We see them, being a strain on the system that was not designed for them. And so all this research is about finding an accommodation on these two thoughts. One, pre-Canada. The other big one, the controlling one, is after Canada.
Uh-huh.
And we would never, ever fit into the Canada model, because how do you get away from yourself? Where do we go? Do we put on our suit and move to Edmonton and be part of the society and work at Walmart or work in a big corporate office? Sure, some would do well in that area, but the majority of the people would always be here, because we had a life, and everybody took care of each other. But there's been, a breakdown in that system, and we're concentrating a lot on everybody's concentrating on trying to make things better. But the big thing is that part of the Western way of thinking is that you have to be living in a municipality so that the liabilities can be controlled and infrastructure can be kept to a minimum, and it's a straightforward public transaction. But and so that's the narrative that drives everybody to stay in a community, because if you don't, then there's punishment. So there's, that you're not doing what you should be doing for the betterment of your kids or your community or whatever. That the narrative has to be changed to say that there's nothing wrong with living in a bush, like living in a small community like Wapiti or Kamiti or large community like Wati. Yes, they're living in a community, but most of their pursuit of livelihood is out on the land. Whether they spend overnight or a couple of days or even a day, it's still part of harvesting. That keeps them in a healthy way by going out and getting your food and bringing it back and feeding your family. But you don't have that security net around you, because you're supposed to be living in a municipality. You're supposed to be paying your water, pay for the deliveries, send your kids to school, and then go work for somebody. That's the way of life. But that's something that was brought over. That over here, we don't fit into that model. Well, one, what do you do with the money? Even if you made it, sure, well, we have to spend it all on just surviving in a community, but not enough to make investments to go into the bush, because there's no training plans, there's no training dollars, because it's all on the Western Front. So the things that are happening in Canada today and in many pockets across Canada is back to the land incentives, back to the land, getting your feet wet and starting that narrative that, in the Western world, not everybody works. The majority, there's much more, a majority of Canadians that would outnumber the Indigenous peoples, and we might even be at the same level in poverty. And because you still have in the Western world people of the land who go and grow things on the land. They would do things that are natural. But a lot of the incentives is about development. It's about resource extractions. So you have a big part of a society that don't fit into that model, and they're labeled as strains on the system. But they have a lot of gifts themselves. They have a lot of thought processes themselves, and if they want to live off the grid, that they should have the ability to do so. So the land, is used to build up, big corporations and big economics. But at the same time, it's not feeding back into, strengthening what the original use of the land is. That to benefit, we have to create these big holes across the world, and and ignore the real story of those lands that were there before, because there's even though when we come to kind of are up here, you go on the skidoo or something, that you don't go far enough to you stay within your level of comfort. So it's an experiment of going out, and if you have a breakdown, you just don't know what to do. You run out of gas, or you forgot your glove, or you don't have the right socks. That you want to ensure that you have everything before you go, because you want to come back. But for a lot of the people that are not part of the mainstream thing, there is no security net. That there is no security net, and if you're out there, you're just out there. And so that's the I guess the decolonizing research is about that. That if we're going to do research of any sort, that we need to ensure that there's space made for the indigenous thought process, because we don't fit into the natural grid of Canada. We're relegated to this little box. And if we get out that little box, we're going straight into governance. So we still need to make arrangements with all these entities that have all these rights of research. That if you're going to do research with us, we want to ensure that the information is going to come back and we'll benefit from that research too.
Wow, John. I'm not going to paraphrase what you said, because there's just so much that you've shared here, and you've touched on all of the topics that I had come into this conversation wanting to talk with you about, like ways of being, surviving, thriving, and adapting to change. But also, really, you've given me some great analogies here. You and I have both canoed the Trails of the Ancestors. You've been doing it a lot longer than me, but you always said to me,
that a canoe trip is not really a canoe trip without portages. And this analogy about getting your feet wet, or knowing what to do if you have a breakdown and you're out there on the land, not knowing what to do, right? In this experiment. This experiment that I'm going on is Decolonizing Research. And you've given me so much great teachings here, and I'm really appreciative. So I think that's really quite clear, and I think we're at about 9:15, so I'm going with the flow here. But I really want to thank you for answering, these open-ended questions, for going with me on this sort of experimental ride, and for sharing these knowledge and stories that I intend to share back on the internet. That's a way of shaping policymakers, shaping the university dialogue, and giving it back to Clecho citizens, young people who would be using technology to listen to these stories. So, thank you, John. Do you have anything else you want to add on the internet or on the recording?
No.
Wow. All right. So that concludes my interview with John Bizot. And I'm back now reflecting on the teachings that he just shared. I'm going to just also have a footnote here that the 1977 Berger Inquiry was what John was speaking about when he talked about the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline. There's a report that I acquired from my father, who at the time had been studying some of this work in the North, earning his own master's of social work. And it's a bit ironic that this project is part of my master's program. My relationship with John, one of the pieces that we connected with was I had this book from 1977, The Outcomes of the Berger Inquiry, in my office. And one time John and I were meeting, and he picked up this book and he flipped it open to the first page. There's a picture of one of the hearing locations, and he said, "That's here in Ray Edzo," what Betchico was formerly known as. And there was a picture, and he told me a really funny story about the paint, and he just remembered that there was a time when they had to make everything look and smell really great because the inquiry was coming to town, and there would be hundreds of people talking to Justice Thomas Berger. And during the hearing, every time someone walked up to get up to the mic, you could hear their shoes squishing on the new paint. And that was all captured on audio recording as part of the 1977 Berger Inquiry. During John's interview, we did end up covering all four themes. And I mentioned at the end that I'm not going to paraphrase. I didn't do that on the call, but just to call to attention that, the first theme that we wanted to talk about, that I prepared John with, was to talk about ways of being. And he really did touch on that when he talked about pre-contact. The Clecho always knowing that they have a language, culture, and way of life. And he talked about pre-Canada times when Clecho had a life and everybody took care of each other. And in that, he's also referring to pre-Canada Dene laws that existed since time immemorial. Then he talks about the resilience of thriving during this time of after Canada. And he really is only able to do that in contrast of pre-Canada, after Canada, right? But he talks about these Western methods of measurement. And I love this quote where he says, "How do we get away from yourself? Where do we go? Do you just put on your suit and move to Edmonton and be a part of the society and work at Walmart?" It really touches on this contrast between pre-Canada and after Canada, and how young people today are having to make that bridge between the two societies, and have to make it work. So one of the ways that he really emphasizes is about raising our voice. He talks about those partnerships, and he says partnerships with universities are really important, and he even goes on to extend that to partnerships with companies. I'm sure he's also talking about industry that's in the Northwest Territories, and industry on the traditional territories of the Clecho, being diamond mines. He also talks about how research can lead to transforming policies and telling stories to young people, telling Clicho own stories, and that nowadays young people are listening to electronic messages like this podcast, which is a bit ironic because this is one of the mediums that we hope to reach people of all ages. But that the Clicho also have their own archive of elders' recorded stories, and those exist for Clicho, by Clicho, in the Clicho government's archives, and that he calls attention to revitalizing and revisiting those audio recordings. And then finally, he sort of bookends the whole discussion that we had, starting and ending with decolonizing research. And really, my big takeaway is that one of the quotes he says here is, meaningful decolonization is to change the way the system operates. And so I have to take away from that there is transformative change that is required as we are decolonizing our research and those partnerships and ways of being and reconnecting and revitalizing with this medium and audio recording as storytelling and story listening. Thanks for listening to this first episode, and I hope to be back with another one quite soon. Take care. With care. Bye-bye.